Welcome to the Northeast Divide podcast, and I'm joining you for a very special guest appearance from Kieran Maguire, football finance expert. You may already have heard of him, I'm sure, before you've seen this video or listened to this on one of your free apps. If you enjoyed the podcast today, my big ask is just to like the video, just to say that you did like it, or comment on your providers. And as Kieran will tell you, it doesn't matter what you say, as long as you say something. That's what we're after. Kieran, thanks for joining us. Before we start, because there will be, believe it or not, there will be one or two listeners who may not have heard of you. Can you just give us a bit of an overview of kind of what it is you do, and actually how you got into the world of football finance, I suppose, and how this became your kind of career as such?
Like many things in life, it's just one of those accidents. I've been teaching since the 80s, teaching at uni, and sorry, just watching my wife try to back into a car there. And all of my teaching life's been in Manchester and Liverpool, which of course two massive football cities. So I teach finance, and what I found out fairly quickly that is, if I'm trying to explain something in the world of finance, and I'm using Vodafone or Marks and Spencers or BP, and I've got 300 20-year-olds at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning, 3/4 of them aren't going to turn up, and the ones that do, they spend all the time saying, Kieran, when are you going to finish? So I quickly learned that if I flip that and I start talking about the local football clubs or any football clubs, everybody's got an interest in those big cities, in Manchester United, Manchester City, Liverpool, Everton, and so on. So I've been using football finance as a Trojan horse to teach traditional finance. And I'm very fortunate. I've got a job which I genuinely love. But university pay is bobbins. So I moonlight. We have many, we get decent holidays in the summer. Yes, I'm supposed to do some research, but I've actually done that in the world of football finance. So part of my moonlighting is I teach for investment banks. I teach those people how to value a business, including football clubs and so on. And it just so happened in 2005, I was down teaching at a bank, and there's a bit of a kerfuffle taking place. I said, what's going on? He says, one of our clients, the Glazer family, we're about to announce a huge deal for them to acquire Manchester United. And I said, okay, what's the deal? And we went through sort of the framework of the deal and the numbers involved. And it's fairly standard what they were doing. Yeah, there was nothing exceptional about it, except it was Manchester United. It doesn't matter who you support. Manchester United is an iconic football club in this country, and famous all around the world. So I didn't think anything of it. Finished my teaching. That was down in Canary Wharf. Got on the train, heading back home. University phones me up and says, BBC wants somebody to go on the breakfast sofa tomorrow morning and explain this deal. And we know that you're a complete fraud, because when you're supposed to be teaching what you're teaching, you're actually all you do is talk about football. So it's payback time now. So I went on the breakfast sofa, and I'll be honest, I was a little bit nervous, because you would be under those circumstances. And I didn't make a fool of myself. So the next time a football finance story came in, you're on somebody's list of names to do things. Yeah. So it started off very slowly. Liverpool University then effectively headhunted me 10, 11 years ago, because they actually run a dedicated football MBA course, and said, would I teach the finance course? And for me, this as a teacher, that's as good as it can get. And then on the back of that, football finance has become a bigger issue, because we've got takeovers. The numbers have got lots more zeros in them. We've got Super League and financial fair play, and all of these elements which have come into it. And you've got the lunatics like Todd Bowley at Chelsea and his amortization policy. So the media has needed somebody. They needed to fill that space, because they're open 24 hours a day, and people have become more interested in it, because football means so much more to us than any other industry. If the guy that I get that services my car each year, if he goes bust, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'll guess. I'm really sorry you're out of business. And what do? I go to the next garage down the road, and I don't think too much of it. If Sunderland go bust, you don't say, "Oh God, that's a pity." Right? Okay. Come on the tune. The chances of you saying that are fairly remote.
From the Sunderland fans I know, Kieran, they're remote to to none whatsoever.
So there's a chance of approximately zero of that taking place. So football is this unique industry, and I presented to the fan-led review in terms of the finances. On the back of that, the government has asked me to do some work. So I've put out some papers on behalf of the government. I'm not party political. I'm going to Buckingham Palace next month, which is far more exciting for my wife than it is for me. For services to football, and I do a podcast, and I've written a couple of books, and I'm having a whale of a time because it's a hobby, but what I do, which I get paid for.
Yeah, no, superb. And how did the podcast come about, Kieran? Because this is probably, it's funny, there's like you and Kevin talk about it, and you joke about the BAFTAs and all this kind of thing, but I mean, it's honestly, I'll tell you, apart from obviously I do podcasts for True Faith, so I listen to all of that and all the stuff on their Patreon channel. But the next thing I listen to, Kieran's your pod. Like, and for it to be, it is such a niche thing, isn't it, really? And I suppose you talk about when it started, it was like, well, if we have one show 20 minutes a week, that'll probably be enough. And now you've got two shows, and normally sometimes three because there's interviews. Like how did the podcast come about? And is it just the fact that, I don't know, PSR and owners doing whatever they're doing is just driven the material for you?
Again, we've been quite fortunate. I used to do the football finance stories for 5 Live. I used to be interviewed, and there's a program which goes out at 5 o'clock in the morning called Wake Up to Money.
Yes.
Now, most guests on that show will phone in. I'm an absolute pain in the backside. I'm irritatingly cheerful 24 hours a day. So for me, getting to a radio station at 5 o'clock in the morning is fine. I'll do that. Then I'll perhaps go to the gym. Then I'll go to work. So it was never a bother for me. So I used to do that, and I got to know one of the presenters on that, a guy called Guy Loveday. So Guy Kilty. And he phoned me up one day and said, I'm going to leave 5 Live. I think the future of broadcasting is podcasts. I want to set up a football finance podcast, and I'd like you to do it. So we had a meeting, and I think there was some disagreement. I think it's fair to say, first of all, in terms of I didn't think that there'd be an audience for it. I didn't think there'd be enough material for it. But also, I don't think podcasts work as a lecture. All the ones which I enjoy listening to, there's normally 2 people presenting. It's either sort of a Q&A, or they're expressing alternate views and so on. So we sort of came to that agreement. And I was living in Manchester at the time, but I was going through a midlife crisis. I decided that I wanted to move back to Brighton, but continue working in Liverpool, because I'm a Brighton fan. And you'll understand this as a fan. It's not about the 90 minutes. It's about the 90 minutes before and the 90 minutes after, just as much. And because I was living in Manchester, I got a season ticket at Brighton. It meant that anybody that's been to Brighton will know this, that the trains are an absolute nightmare. And to get from the stadium to Falmouth Station to Brighton Station to Victoria across London, and then catch the last train back up to Manchester, involved a bit too much sprinting, and I couldn't go and have a chat with my mates after the game. So I'd said to my wife, here's the deal, we'll move down to Brighton. I promise I'll never bitch about commuting to Liverpool, and I haven't. And Guy had said, well, we'll get somebody local. Let's get Justin Morehouse, because he's from Manchester. He's a big football fan. I think it's you. And I'd say, I think having somebody, I've got a pretty dry job. I'm an accountant, I'm a teacher, I'm a teetotal. I'm about as dull an establishment as you can be. So I think we should get somebody who's funny. I liked what Brian Cox was doing with his show, with Robin Ince. I think it's good to have somebody with a sense of humour to ask the right questions. So we talked about Justin, and I said to Guy, look, I'm moving down south. It's going to cause us problems. And then I suggested we get in contact with Kevin, because I remember Kevin from Match of the Day too. And he always used to do those sort of vox pops. He'd go to, if he was coming to the Northeast, he'd go to a local brewery and talk to the owners there, and then they'd go to the match together, and he'd talk to fan groups, and he'd get on coaches and go on coach trips with fans. And so I've always sort of liked his style. We just pitched to him via Twitter, said, "Do you fancy doing this?" And Kevin's a really nice. He likes to come across as being really cynical, but he's a softie. He's a really nice guy, and he was too polite to tell us to piss off. So we turned up, and I could see, because I'm a complete nerd. I could see him going, "Why have I agreed to do this?" And he was thinking to himself, this will be a bit like a holiday romance. You go away from a fortnight, you fall in love with somebody, you have some fun for a week or two, you go back home, and you pretend you never were in contact with each other. So that's I think was his attitude. When we launched the show, it was just after Bury had gone bust, and we were both quite angry about what had happened there. So it gave us a good start story. And then the stories just multiplied. You've had issues yourself with Stuart Donald. I've still got a 10-page email from Charlie Methven at Sunderland, which I will get round to responding to on one occasion, saying that I was picking on him and Stuart Donald. So you got all of these characters that have come into football, and Mike Ashley, of course, at Newcastle as well, and then the takeover and will it, won't it, and there is a soap opera surrounding Amanda Staveley, whether you like to admit it or not. And I can tell you stories off air, which we can't repeat on air, which you go, bloody hell, that's wasn't quite what I was expecting, and so on. So the show's just become a success, and we now get ministers wanting to come on the show. We get chief executives, new owners of clubs, and it's created a bit of a tension, because to a certain extent, I like being independent. I like being anti-establishment. I'm loathed by the Premier League, and that makes me quite proud. Because you can take them on, but we become really good friends with the SPFL. We've become really good friends with the EFL, and so on. And it means I'm never rude about my friends. So I think they've realised what I've now got is clubs will send me financial information before it goes public, and they know that A, I won't leak it because that would be unprofessional, but B, I'll probably give them a bit of a softer ride.
Well, this is it, and I think if anyone's going to want a perspective on a big financial story in the football world, they'll listen to The Price of Football, won't they, and what have you. But I've done the plug-in for you. Not that you need it, Kieran. It's a great show, as we know. So the one of the main reasons I reached out to you, Kieran, is Newcastle United and Sunderland are on very different journeys financially. How this may seem like a really obvious question to ask, or not almost like an obvious answer, but how big's the gap, and kind of in terms of what Sunderland can do and achieve with their finances, and where Newcastle
are? Sunderland need a good season. That's all that they need. And you might say, well, they've got a relatively new owner who's come in, and you've had that honeymoon period at Roker Park, and that honeymoon period in football doesn't last very long. They are back in the Championship. The problem with the Championship is that on average, clubs are losing £20 million a year. Now, in the Premier League, you've got plenty of clubs losing money as well. But at least the owner of that club can say, yeah, okay, but next Saturday we've got Manchester City coming to town, and I can invite some of my friends to the director's box, and they can go and see Haaland and De Bruyne and so on, and that's quite appealing. In the Championship, the problem you've got is you've got clubs with parachute payments who have got a 30-40 million pound head start at the start of each season. You've got other owners who are willing to underwrite those losses significantly, even clubs that probably don't even register. So if we take Bristol City, for example, Bristol's a big city. It's the same as Sunday. Bristol is a big city. It's a 2-club city. People forget that, and yet it doesn't seem to get any attention. The guy that owns Bristol City puts in £20 million of his own money every single season. And that has an impact upon the average level of wages in that division. And then you see what's happening at Preston, where the owner was putting in £1 million a month, and the same at Millwall, and the same, so many clubs. So I think what is it Kirill Louis Dreyfus? Have I got that right?
I think, I pretend that I don't know his full name, but I think that's right.
Yes. He bought the club. There was that was the club was Sunderland was promoted, absolutely great. I think that set a level of expectation, because the way that he was marketed to the club is that he's from a very wealthy family. What do football fans want from very wealthy families? They want to be treated like sugar daddies.
Yeah.
And what do sugar daddies do? Sugar daddies give you expensive trinkets, and they take you to nice places. And no disrespect, but Millwall on a Tuesday night perhaps doesn't fit into that. And I think the level of expectation in terms of the amount of money which has been spent by Sunderland has surprised some fans who perhaps had convinced themselves that Kirill Louis Dreyfus was just going to become a mini Abramovich or a mini Mansour, or a mini PIF, and just turn the taps on. And Sunderland, on the back of that, would be able to be more competitive at the top of the Championship, which is a brutal division. I think it's the most exciting division in English football. I watched the Watford Leeds match last night, and it was great entertainment. It's absolutely spectacular goals, and less corporate, less sanitized than the Premier League. So there are some amazing things about the Championship. It's the 5th most popular division in the world. It's ridiculous in terms of average attendances. So it's an amazing achievement. But it does mean that it's very competitive. The 3 sides that came down at the end of last season are all what you call pretty much heavyweights. It wasn't a case of, no disrespect, Luton went up last season, fantastic, well done. There's more than a 50-50 chance they'll probably come down, and their next season back in the Championship, they won't be seen as a favourite to return to the Premier League, whereas Leeds, Southampton, and Leicester are all heavyweights in their own regard. So it's a really tough Championship this season, which I think is causing further frustration for Sunderland fans. We've not seen the accounts yet, which is frustrating from my point of view. How much money has been put in? We don't know. I'm a great believer in transparency as far as clubs are concerned. Clubs are not great believers in transparency. They like to keep their cards close to their chest. So I think from a Sunderland point of view, does the owner have money? Yes. Is there a bit of leeway in terms of what can be spent from a financial fair play point of view? Yeah, there is. Is he going to spend that money? Well, on the evidence to date, not necessarily. And that further, I think, frustrates fans, because what we've done is that we've created this mentality, and I think the media have a lot to blame for this, is that if you're allowed to lose £39 million over 3 years in the Championship, fans think that unless you are losing £39 million in the Championship over 3 years, it's a lack of ambition. But actually, you know what they're doing? It's subsidy.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. Like, I think you've a couple of things you've touched on there, Kieran, which I just want to elaborate on. I think this whole idea that PSR and FFP, and I've got a feeling that I've gauged your feelings on this over the podcast over the years. It's not really there to protect clubs from going out of business. It's there to protect a very small amount of clubs at the top, either up in the largest clubs in Europe or the largest clubs in the Premier League, to keep them kind of in position. And I think the term you use is pull the ladder away, in terms of climbing up. And the idea that any business could sustainably lose £39 million over a 3-year period, or sustainably lose £105 million over a 3-year period, seems absolutely ludicrous. And you have a situation like Manchester United where the Glazers bought a football club, but not using their money, and the club was not in debt, is now in masses of debt, and they can still spend more than anyone else. Like, it baffles me from that point of view. But I suppose we'll go on to that in a little bit. So Sunderland are in a position where they could potentially spend more. We don't know because we've not seen the accounts, but they could potentially spend more, but we don't know. Newcastle are in a position where I'm assuming, certainly from what they're trying to put out there, they can't spend anymore because they're being handcuffed and the world is unfair.
Yes, I think that's a good way of summarising it. What Newcastle want to do is exactly the same as Roman Abramovich wanted to do when he acquired Chelsea, is exactly the same as what Sheikh Mansour wanted to do when he acquired Manchester City, which is to invest significant sums of money into talent, because football is a talent game, to utilise that to accelerate up the league. And you talk to Chelsea fans and you talk to Manchester City fans, you won't find any of them having a bad word about Abramovich or Mansour. And once they've used that to establish the club as what you might call a senior club in the Premier League, one of the sneaky six, one of the Super League six, whatever you want to call them, then the club will be making so much money from commercial deals. It will be making so much money from regular appearances in the Champions League and making progress in the Champions League, that particular club can become self-sufficient. What people don't realise is that Manchester City, they break even most years. And in fact, they tend to make a small profit because they're actually very good at the. Whilst all the focus is on what they're buying in terms of players, under the radar goes the fact that they've got a very successful model in terms of developing talent and then selling that talent on. But because it's quite often in the £8 to £10 million bracket, or if Leroy Sané goes, or Riyad Mahrez or Cole Palmer, they don't get the credit for actually extracting maximum value. And they did the same with Raheem Sterling. He was a fantastic player for City. I think it's fair to say he's not ripped up the trees at Chelsea since he's left. And there's various things that you can say about Chelsea, none of which are nice, but practically all of which are deserved, in terms of the culture of that club, which has possibly caused that to be the case. So if it's okay for Chelsea to do it, if it's okay for Manchester City to do it, and I would argue that the Premier League is better as a result, because you're much younger than I am, John, but I remember the start of the Premier League. I was at the time I was supporting a team that was in League One, League Two, and just on our asses at the time. Premier League was entertaining, but it was a bit predictable because Manchester United won it 7 times out of 10, and Arsenal won it 3 times out of 10, and you go, well, this is the future of football. What Abramovich did was that he converted a duopoly into a triopoly. And what Mansour did meant that we now had 4 teams. You've got to give the Liverpool owners a huge amount of credit for what they've done without spending the same level of money. They've introduced Moneyball. Spurs have created a different model in the sense that they've built up from infrastructure, and they have bought smartly. So we genuinely do have more than 2 contenders for the Premier League. That causes a problem because 6 into 4 doesn't go when it comes to Champions League places. So how can we stop 6 into 4 becoming 7 into 4 if somebody comes along with huge wealth and is willing to put that into Newcastle United? You set up a structure nominally to have financial prudence and control, but actually to put limits on what clubs are able to do in terms of investment. So it's not there to create a level playing field. It's not there to allow new people to enter the sneaky 6. Old money hates new money, and that just doesn't apply to football. If one of my mates was fortunate enough, he won a lot of money on the lottery, but because I'm from Irish migrant working class background, he's similar. He applied to join certain golf clubs. He was turned down because he didn't look right. He hadn't gone to the right school. He tried to move upwards, in terms of, he wanted to go to places. His missus wanted to go to places. He had the money. He didn't have the welcome though. So, old money likes to keep us in our place. And by us, I mean, what they consider to be the great unwashed.
It's crazy, isn't it? Absolutely crazy world we're in. But that's unfortunately the way that the world goes round, I suppose. I think in terms of we were going to talk about this later, but I think actually it links in quite nicely now. I personally, right, I think I've got no issue with the idea that you shouldn't be able to buy. I don't think you should be able to buy a football club, put billions into it, and then all of a sudden win everything, and you just constantly pump that money and have it going. I think there needs to be an element of regulation, right? I totally accept that. I think the biggest issue I've had with all of this stuff's been around timing, because in October 21, when the takeover happened, straight away there was a limit on any related party transactions. Now, we're not just talking about Man City and Chelsea here. Like the likes of Wigan did this, the likes of Leicester did this, because the owners, and I think probably traditionally through smaller. I mean, I remember, I think Fatboy Slim sponsored the front of your shirt for a bit, was Skint, was the famous sponsor. So you've got, related parties do these things, and they do put money in ways to do that. But for me, it was about the timing of it all. It all came along, and it was like, well, this is clearly about Newcastle. It's clearly about restricting them. And then, I think in terms of the PSR and the changes that are going to happen there, that's very much about aligning to UEFA. And the other thing, which I find really interesting, is so for those who haven't seen the new regulations, it's going to be 70% of your spend is capped in terms of player costs, which is wages, amortization, and agent fees. If I'm right, Kieran,
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Thought so. It's 85% for anyone that doesn't qualify for Europe. Now, if you're Chelsea and you don't qualify for Europe, that gives you a hell of an advantage that year in terms of how you could do, and essentially will jump you back up. Now, the other argument is that someone who's missed out in Europe gives them a chance to get into that space. But it feels like get into that space for a temporary basis until we kick you out.
Yeah.
I mean, is that I'm on the right lines, aren't I?
Yeah. And what we've got is that with UEFA expanding its tournaments from next season, partly to head off the alternative, which would have been the franchise. It's nothing super about Super League. It's a franchise league. Yeah, it was invitation only. Even the revamped version, if you take a look at the small print, and that's what I do. I was quite lucky that the original Super League and the original project Big Picture was leaked to me by journalists, and I'll go through it on a line by line basis because I'm a nerd, and that's what nerds do. And they were both horrendous in terms of concentrating power, control, decision making, and money in the hands of project big picture, which was probably worse than Super League in my regard, in the hands of 6 clubs, and allowing those 6 clubs to sell their own TV rights, and then saying, oh well, you know, the EFL will now have 25% of what's remaining. Yeah, okay, 25% of Burnley versus Bournemouth. You know, try selling that to the American market and see how much money you get. So it absolutely was going to stiff all of the clubs, including potentially, you know, Newcastle and Sunderland. Super League was no better. So the rules are there to again, and the only credit I'll give to UEFA to say, yeah, we're not interested in a level playing field ourselves. And UEFA is terrified of the ECA. The ECA stands for the European Club Association. Now, the European Club Association, it has about 200 members, but not all of those members can vote. The votes are very much held in the hands of a few clubs, and it won't take you. It doesn't take a genius to know who's got those enhanced voting rights.
Which 12 clubs may have those enhanced voting rights? Dear me, it's scary though, isn't it? That's where we are. I do have I think just because this links better with the Newcastle thing that we've just been talking about, I'll ask this one first, and then we'll return to Sunderland briefly for the end. So my first question is, if you were in charge of all of this stuff, Kieran, given your expertise, given the way that you've seen football clubs operate, what regulation would you put in place to actually help clubs be sustainable but not compromise competition?
Right, I'd do 2 things, and rightly or wrongly, I'm quite friendly with Simon Jordan, which for a Brighton fan, given that he's a former Crystal Palace owner, is an unusual thing to say. Although he did put Crystal Palace into administration, so we all secretly like him for doing that. He and I have quite regular conversations, and there's a couple of things which I think we probably broadly agree on. First of all, what's the fear? The fear, I think, amongst football fans is that if you have a benevolent owner, what happens if A, their circumstances change, or B, they just decide they don't want to do it anymore? And I'll give you a couple of examples. Roman Abramovich's circumstances changed in respect of Chelsea. Yeah, he'd still like to be the Chelsea owner, but Russia invaded Ukraine. He had links with Putin. Putin, as somebody that used to work in Moscow on a regular basis, Putin is a gangster. Russia is a mafioso country, and I'm quite happy to be quoted on that. And he was therefore no longer able to fund Chelsea. Chelsea cost Roman Abramovich £900,000 a week for 18 years, or 19 years. Yeah. And it didn't bother him. Yeah, he'd have that enigmatic smile every time the cameras honed in on him. Didn't bother the coach, didn't bother the players. They all were well paid. Didn't bother the fans. Chelsea had gone from, and I'm old enough to remember Chelsea as a club who would, finish 8th to 10th each season. Once every 5 or 6 years, they'd have a good cup run. Yeah, they were always a cup team, Chelsea, never a challenge. And so he transformed Chelsea. So what could be done? Well, what you could say is that owners of clubs have to put down a bond in a similar way as that if you want to be a licensed travel agent, if you want to be a licensed organizer, and if you want to go into other certain industries, you have to put down an amount of money. And it's a bit like an insurance policy. If things go wrong at the club, you've now got this central fund which can be used to allow that club to survive until you find a new owner. So that would be option number 1. And the more money it's costing you to buy and run the club, the more money you put into the bond. So therefore, it is linked to wealth. The second thing that I would do would be to have a wealth tax to say that you'll have a wage ceiling, but it's not going to be a percentage of your revenue. You'll agree it as a flat amount. And if anybody wants to buy a club, the trouble with the Newcastle position is that Newcastle are playing catch up. And if you're playing catch up, as we saw with both Chelsea and Manchester City, you've got to pay more money than everybody else because the players are going, well, you're not in the Champions League. I've not heard of Newcastle. I have heard of City and Chelsea because they win all these trophies. So therefore, you've got to go and pay over the odds. So as far as the wealth tax is concerned, you set your maximum wage limit, whatever it is, you make sure it's competitive at the top level. So therefore that the likes of Manchester City and Liverpool, Manchester United and Chelsea, they're not being disadvantaged when they play in Europe, because we want to see sort of English clubs being successful in Europe. As a Brighton fan going into Europe this season, you will have known, following Newcastle in Europe, fantastic experience, lifelong memories. So the way that the wealth tax would work is that you set this ceiling, and then for every pound that you pay in transfer fees and wages above this agreed limit, you have to pay £1. So for the next £10 million, you pay tax at 100%. So for every £1 you put in, you pay £1 in tax. For the next 10 million, it's 150%. So you can spend as much money as you want, but it's going to cost you more. So that will make the owners think twice. That money, that additional money, which goes into the tax, that's the way I do it. 50% of it would be distributed between the other Premier League clubs, and the other 50% would go to EFL, grassroots football, and so on. So that's an option. That's a proposal, and it would mean that if you are richer than God, it's not just your club's going to benefit. There would still be some competitive benefits to other clubs as well, and more money would go into the overall football pyramid.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting we talk about competitiveness, and the American owners get a lot thrown at them, I think, from a perception point of view, because actually what American owners are used to, and I know this is a bit of an NFL fan, is they're used to these franchises are businesses and they make money. It's not like over here, the salary cap's 50% of everything they earn. So then, the rest goes to the owners. But the flip side of that is that the NFL is built so it can be competitive on a regular basis, because the worse you do, the better your draft pick is, and so on and so forth. So then, it's very rare that you get situations where, I think the Patriots was a very rare situation where for 20 years they were fairly dominant. Apart from that, it's usually pretty competitive. But that's the bit that the Premier League aren't doing, and I think that's the bit that's the short-sightedness of it. It's about no, we need to get richer. We need to get richer. The last question I was going to ask you, Kieran. So, as a Brighton fan, you will remember, as I do very fondly, the 2016-17 season when Newcastle won the league on the last day. There were some scarves that had been made from a Brighton side saying that they were champions. There's one that actually regularly visits the away end at the Amex once a year. But just on all of that, Brighton are probably regarded as one of the best run clubs in the Premier League, which is very different to kind of certainly where you were in the mid-90s, where you fighting for your lives, and obviously I've heard you did a lot of campaigning around that time to try and save the club and what have you. They're now regarded as one of the best run clubs. If you were to take that 16-17 Brighton kind of structure side and put that into the Championship now, because I think we both comfortably got promoted that year, I think it's fair to say. But would that happen? Could that happen again? Because I think my fear is, you look at Leicester are essentially the 21st Premier League club in the strength they were. Leeds, I think you would argue 22nd. Obviously, Leicester are currently doing a good job of trying to throw away their promotion race as they go. But you get my point. Like, you've got these clubs that go up, they get the rich already, or they get relegated. They then have a massive parachute payment. What chance does even the best run Championship club have of getting up? And even if Sunderland was run as well as Brighton was, what chance would they have of actually getting to the promised land and being in a position to stay there?
I think that is still feasible, because remember, Huddersfield went up that season with Brighton and Newcastle.
Yeah.
Since then, we've seen Brentford A, go up, and B, stay up. Luton Town went up, Forest have gone up, Coventry could have gone up last season. So is it more difficult if you don't have parachute payments? Yes, it is to a certain extent. Although, if you look at some of the clubs that come down, Leicester sold Maddison and Harvey Barnes, and Tielemans left, and Castagna left. Leicester have lost quite a few players. Leeds, a lot of their players have gone out on loan. As far as Brighton in 2016-17, Brighton was still losing 15 to 20 million pounds a year when they were in the Championship, but the owner had had a long-term vision, a long-term plan. And his plan was to be smarter rather than bigger than the clubs it was up against. Brighton in the Championship, they were getting crowds of 28, 30,000. So they're doing okay. It's decent, not spectacular by Championship standards, but it certainly put them top 6, top 8 in terms of attendances. So therefore, they were competitive in terms of match day revenue. They had a good sponsor relationship. That's gone on for a long time. So that's increased the money coming in a wee bit. Then it comes down to having a long-term vision, and that's what the owner did. So I still think that they would be competitive, mainly due to the fact that in Tony Bloom, I think you've got, for me, the perfect mix of characteristics that you want as an owner. He is stupidly smart. I've met him once. I'm a university lecturer. And I always say to people, I'm not super smart. I'm street smart. And that's why I'm good at explaining things. I work with professors who are super smart, who talk at a different level. Tony Bloom's the only person I've sort of been close to, listening to him talk in a room. I'd say to myself, I'm in the presence of a genius, an absolute genius. When he is 3 or 4 steps ahead. So he's got a degree in maths, so he understands finances, he understands numbers. I think it's well known that his background also, he loves horses, he loves gambling, he's a professional poker player. So he's used to assessing risk, and he's a fan of the club. So you've got a genius who happens to be a fan of the club. Oh, he's a billionaire as well. You put those 3 factors together, and we are ridiculously lucky to have him. People say Brighton are really well run. What people don't realise is that Tony Bloom has put in £500 million of his own money into Brighton Hove Albion to get them to where they are today. So it's not been cheap. What you will find is, because of the success, especially of the last 2 seasons, the club will start to repay him a wee bit of that money. But I'm talking, 10, 20, 30 million perhaps. Not that he needs it, but he's probably got new ideas on how to invest that money. So I still think it can be done. If you take a look at the other clubs that have been promoted since Brighton, Brentford, again, super smart owner. Luton Town, I've spoken to Gary Sweet, their chief executive, again, really impressed me with a guy who's got a vision. I think if you've got owners who have come into the Premier League because they've been successful in their own business, they think that that's transferable into football, they get seduced by spending a few quid, and then they get the trousers taken down because the people that they're listening to are agents and managers who sometimes have self-interest rather than the interests of the club long term. Then they tend to get taken advantage of.
Yeah. Kieran, thank you so much for your time this morning. I've really enjoyed this. Everybody for listening, watching, really appreciate you doing that. If you liked what you watched, again, I please ask you to like it, and please leave a comment. And as Kieran would probably say, you could say that you'd rather this show was hosted by Mike Ashley and Charlie Methven. It wouldn't make a blind bit of difference at all to us in terms of the algorithm. Just thank you for supporting the show, and take care and goodbye.